How's it going, Professor Wathan? My name is Nick Smith, and I'm here to talk to you about the Pueblo Revolution of 1680. And yeah, so let's jump right into it. In the beginning, there's some important aspects that lead up to the actual event, because this was an event that started in 1680, but was caused by the events in the century prior. So from like the late 1500s all the way up to 1680, there were things that happened with the Spaniards and with the native Pueblos that really led to this boiling point. It was an event that happened in New Mexico, modern day New Mexico, but it was mainly surrounded in Santa Fe was the actual climax of it. But it happened all throughout the tribes, going all the way from like the Zuni to Santa Fe, all the way up to Taos, and in between all the Pueblo tribes as well endured these hardships from the Spanish coming over and trying to colonize. It's also known as Pope's Rebellion because it is in honor of the guy who was kind of the mastermind behind all the revolutionary thoughts and the idea that the Pueblo people didn't need to be oppressed by the Spaniards because it was their land and they didn't deserve to be pushed down or pushed out their views because of what the Spaniards came to colonize for. So now that we have the ideas on what really led up to this, the real background of the 1680 revolution is that there were some certain events that led up to this. And in the early 1500s, the Spaniards had actually tried to colonize once and they had failed. And it had taken a while and a little ego swallowing for the Spanish and King Philip II eventually to say, we're going to do this and we're going to do this with a renewed effort and we're going to do this with more manpower and more oomph behind our ideas. And so they did. And he spearheaded this with Juan de Anote, who led this first renewed mission and was the Spanish conquistador of Spanish conquistadors. He was powerful, he was loved, charismatic, and he knew what had to be done, and that's why King Philip II trusted him with really one of the most important trials for the Spanish because they had failed previously. And they attempted to go over and colonize for gold and silver, of course, which they had found in South America. And as working their way up north, they wanted to find more. But their underlying idea was to give them a sense of the Spanish culture, which was Christianity, and indoctrinate these people to their culture. Well, Juan de Anote is a notable figure because he had disputes with the native people in Acoma, which was the largest pueblo at the time and the most necessary for him to speak with, to infiltrate. And the Acoma Pueblos actually killed 13 Spaniards, one of which was De Anote's nephew. And he retaliated by showing his true colors to the people, which was killing almost the entire Pueblo, about 1,000 people, and leaving 500 to sit in the ashes and see who he really was. And this friction began to rub, and this caused the native people to see who this man was and who the Spanish were and what they were trying to get in reality. Now, this could lead to some problems, and it really did. So these problems were just compounded and compounded upon because the Spaniards had a complete disregard of the native life and culture and being of who they were before the Spanish has gotten there. They used completely inhumane things and ideas to force the natives in a certain way. They taxed the natives' own crop. They enslaved the natives' own people. And this just began the rub and friction that we spoke about in the beginning. The Spaniards were able to do this so efficiently because they got to the native people. They were infiltrated in as nice, colonizing, but friendly people. And once they were there, once they were close, they were able to use force to turn it on the Pueblos. And this this removal of the Pueblos of their ideas and of their ways of life were so foreign to them. The friction just began to keep rubbing and keep rubbing and keep rubbing. And the Pueblo natives, they didn't like that. And so they began to forcibly resist. And it was in a very secretive way. And they weren't not taking credit for it, but they didn't want it to cause war like it would in many years. But they said they had raiding parties, and they began killing certain people, friars and things like that, to symbolize, or that symbolized to the Spanish people certain things. Their colonization was based on Christianity, and by the Pueblos killing off certain friars, it was a direct opponent to that idea. The native Apaches, actually, which was another tribe of Native Americans, added to this fire at the time by raiding both the native people who were their rival tribes, the native Pueblos, and also the Spanish. And this was difficult already at time, but added with the third party getting in and infiltrating camps and ways of life, it only increased that friction that we spoke about. This drove them to a point that would eventually boil over. These 80 years of occupation, which was said, Emmett Scheme Garcia from the Santa Ana Pueblos, of modern day Pueblos, actually said that. He said that the 80 years of occupation that the Pueblos endured, they had had enough. It was too much for any people to endure, and it was time. It was beyond the time that they required. And amid all this drama going on, all this day-to-day life that they were dealing with, a relatively small but historically significant event occurred, and it was really what this all hinged on. A man by the name of Juan Francisco Trevino arrested 47 of the Pueblo leaders for what he called witchcraft. And this is almost in direct reflection of the later to come, the Salem witch trials. They were used as a platform to gain power of some people through the diminishing of other people. And witchcraft was a common idea back in the day of these times, and so it was something that they could use as a crutch to get what they needed. And Trevino, obviously, he had decided that he had enough, and he didn't want the Pueblo people to feel too strong and too powerful, so he wanted to cut down on their leaders, and he did that. He took away 47 of the most powerful, and he did eventually give back their freedom for most of them. 3 of them actually got hung. And this actually, when you think about where was the line drawn for the Pueblos, well, I believe it was drawn in the mistreatment. And then once this happened, once he killed their leaders and he released some, but he had no regard for their native ways of life, that was, they pushed past that line. The line was drawn, and he pushed past and didn't care. And anyway, he when he released the rest of the leaders that he had arrested, it was him trying to concede and remedy the angst that they had between the two peoples, because he was also a leader in the Spanish and on the Spanish side of things, and he knew that there was unrest. And by doing this, it was a sign of good faith, in his opinion. And really, it wasn't, because he arrested them for no reason in the first place. And so it wasn't seen that way. It was seen that he had murdered in cold blood 3 of their leaders for no reason. It was witchcraft, is what he called it, but it was their own native ways. He didn't understand. He thought that this would, like I said, remedy the situation and prevent any attacks, but it actually caused the very foundation of the revolution to come. Um, Popey was one of these religious leaders, and he was crucial in this because he was arrested as part of the 47 and wrongly arrested, and he was then released after. And the people, the Pueblos, even though they were a somewhat divided community, they all respected this man because of his prowess, of his leadership abilities. And he was very intelligent. He was a healer. He cared. He knew the Pueblo people because that was his people. And it was actually said that he is respected by both the Navajos and the other tribes that surrounded, the ones that raided, the Apaches. He was respected in all Native cultures because of his just immense ability to get to people in the right ways and his correct moral judgment. This would really, this hinges on the fact that the war is coming and Popeye is going to play the largest role in that. So as Popeye was released, the Spanish people in power felt at rest because he had actually retired himself to the Taos Pueblo up north, where they felt he was kind of out of the way. He was not in control anymore. And this is exactly what they wanted from a Pueblo leader. Well, this was not the case. He was actually in more control than he ever was. He was bringing together every Pueblo and even the rival tribes like the Apaches and the Navajo to say, this has got to stop. None of us are benefiting from this, and this is only going to get worse. Like I said, the 80 years of enslavement, the 80 years of occupation was not valid of a point for them to say, this is okay. A man by the name of Michael Wilcox, he was an archaeologist who studied this revolt from an archaeological standpoint, said that he spent over a decade looking at the ground and what happened there. And there was just this great movement that had never been seen before from the Taos Pueblo south. And Taos was the most northern Pueblo. And he said it was kind of obvious. It all pointed to the fact that there must have been some command center up there, which can only lead to the fact that Popeye, it followed him there. Popeye really brought everybody together through his leadership, through everyone's mutual respect for him, and he took everybody and anybody that would fight for him and what was right, and he said, let's do this. He was so enthralled with this idea of revolution that he murdered his own son-in-law for fear of the Spanish finding out, because he was part Spanish and he didn't want his secret plans to get out to anyone. And the sad thing was, they eventually did. And even though he had thorough planning, 2 runners of his messengers actually got captured, and one was tortured and killed, and the other was tortured and enslaved. And the Popeye leadership had decided that this was an infiltration of what they were going to do, and they had a great system of tying knots in their ropes, and that's how many days they would count down. And this was a great system, but they felt it had been infiltrated through the capturing of these 2 messengers. And so Popeye and his system, they decided that they would move up the schedule, that they would beat this idea and say the revolution is coming, but you don't know when. And so on August 10th, 1680, they carried out the bidding of the attack, and they burned churches, they killed preachers and fathers and friars and all of the clergymen that felt as though they had a status in what was taking place in America at the time. And this showed those Spanish that they were not to be trifled with, that this was not okay for what they were doing. And it ended up actually being almost all over 3 days later on the 13th, which was the original day that Pope had planned to attack. And all the Spaniards kind of just, they were scared. They ended up running all to Santa Fe, and they holed up there in the Spanish stronghold, and all the natives said, we'll let y'all get out of here. We'll be amicable about this as much as we can. And so the Spanish people went, and they actually went to El Paso, Texas, modern day El Paso, Texas, which was El Paso de Nord, which meant the pass to the north, and they holed up there, and that's where they stayed for about 12 years until later they were able to come back when all had settled. And this was just, they had been pushed out because this was wrong, and I felt as though they knew it as well. They had to take some of this responsibility, and they stayed back because they had to have seen that. So they did get lucky, the Pueblos, because they were able to push out the oppressors, but the inevitable was going to come, and so to wrap it up, not with a sad note, but 12 years later they did come back, and the relationship was more amicable, so it actually was a benefit. These people didn't die in vain. The 21 of 33 original Christian men of status in the Spanish church that came were killed, not in vain, but as a memory to the fact that nobody needs to be oppressed for the Spanish to colonize. They can colonize with the native people and create a more innovative and untraditional society, a society that can run as it should in a place where they are unfamiliar, and where the native people can also help out. So this ended up working out okay, but it came with a lot of bloodshed and unnecessarily. But thank you for listening, and that was my take on the Pueblo Revolution.